Skyward Sword HD got announced and brought to light the very interesting reputation that the game has within the fandom. The game is one of the more divisive entries in the Zelda franchise, and just bringing it up could ignite a room in fiery debate. But what if I told you this was not always the case? Skyward Sword's journey from its development to its release to being the black sheep of the series is an interesting one to me, and that's why we're going to talk about it. At one point, Skyward Sword was revered, loved, and considered a breath of fresh air for the franchise. Sounds weird, right? In order to explain, we have to go back to the beginning. Skyward Sword started life in the public eye as a teaser image featuring Link in a Twilight Princess style and holding no sword, standing back to back with a mysterious female figure. It wasn't until a few years later that we finally got the first bit of the game that showed off the new art style and the direction the game would take. This was the era of the Wii, a new age for gaming as the console swept the nation and reached new markets that other console makers wouldn't dream of touching. Nintendo's motion-based Wiimote gameplay was leading the way into the future, and video games were finally set to evolve into something more immersive than just a bunch of button presses. In this world, Skyward Sword was set to be the magnum opus. While Twilight Princess brought us sword-swinging gameplay like never before, Skyward Sword was going to deliver on the true promise of fully immersive, sword-based gameplay. After all, Twilight Princess was originally a GameCube game. It wasn't designed around the Wii's new controller and this futuristic style of gameplay. Skyward Sword, however, was built ground up for the full immersive Zelda experience. You were going to swing the sword, aim the bow, thrust the shield, and you were going to do it in the most realistic way that had ever been rendered in a video game. And back in the time when the motion control craze was real, you couldn't help but believe that Nintendo was going to actually deliver on that promise. And they gave it their damnedest shot. Skyward Sword was finally released in November of 2011 and was met with universal acclaim by critics. Reviewers loved this game and the fans were hype. 2011 was about the time when Let's Playing on YouTube was starting to pick up steam, and episodes of other LPs often saw the player talking about how excited they were to get back to playing the game or eventually LPing it. This was really the first game in the series that the internet had a full grasp of. Skyward Sword got a lot of love right off the bat in this way, and one of the big reasons why was its story. Believe it or not, one thing that Skyward Sword was praised for was breaking the conventions of Zelda in that day. Hang on a second, I thought it was Breath of the Wild that did that. Actually, no, Skyward Sword was praised for the same thing. It just went in a different direction. In no area was this more obvious than its approach to story. Skyward Sword was more narrative-driven than any Zelda game before it, and it dared to dive deeper into characterizing characters like Link and Zelda. Link was given more of a personality and was made more expressive, and Zelda actually had a character. More than that, the two had a relationship, a true budding romance that made Link's quest to aid Zelda a more heartfelt endeavor. Hell, Zelda wasn't even a princess in this game. It seems small now, but at the time this was huge and interesting, and at times I'm sure the only thing that kept some players going was seeing Link's arc with Zelda fulfilled. But really, who would have thought that giving the titular character in the series a starring role, a personality, and a journey to go on herself, parallel to the main quest, wouldn't be a great idea? It was like someone looked at Midna's popularity from the last game and said, why don't we do that to the character we want our player to actually care about rescuing? Skyward Sword Zelda is a delight. She's a ray of sunshine, takes no shit, and just wants to see Link be the best he can be. Utterly precious. And of course, Skyward Sword was rounded out by a strong cast of side characters that were memorable in their own right. There really is no other character in the franchise that has as satisfying an arc as Groose, who, when you think about it, takes over Ganondorf's spot in the power trio because for the first time in 11 years, the main villain of the game isn't Ganondorf. Instead, Skyward Sword opted for a new pair of villains in Girahim and his master, Demise. It was widely publicized, and still is, that Skyward Sword told the oldest story in Zelda lore at the time, and conveyed to us key points like the origin of Hyrule, the Master Sword, and the first piece of history that was fated to repeat itself over and over again. It added intrigue to the story to see the unabashed evil that was Demise, and prior to his appearance, Girahim kept everyone suitably uncomfortable. Even a recurring side character like Impa was given us an incredibly satisfying character arc that works itself out in a pretty rewarding way. Simply put, Skyward Sword's writing deserves a lot of praise. So many characters are funny or memorable or cute, and the game is written to highlight this. Whether it's Fi's uncomfortable reaction to a snarky robot having a crush on her, or Groos's utter breakdown upon seeing the surface world for the first time, the story beats were really a highlight of the game and a culmination of where it felt like this series was headed up to that point. And one of the things that allowed this was the game's design. We'll get to talking about the gameplay itself, but one thing I really want to highlight is the way the world is designed, because it's smart and it doesn't get recognized enough. Gone are the wide open fields of Hyrule, and in its place are the sky and the three realms of the surface below. The surface areas are of particular intrigue because they were built with the opposite philosophy to how you'd expect a Zelda to be designed. I remember reading a review that discussed those areas as being clever because they were designed around being obstacle courses more akin to dungeons than traditional Zelda areas, and this was viewed as a good thing. You have to remember, Skyward Sword came on the heels of Twilight Princess, an indulgent, realistic romp with a massive overworld that had little to nothing in it. Twilight Princess's Hyrule felt big for big's sake. The 4 sections of its Hyrule field were impressive, but there wasn't a whole lot actually in them, and they could be broken down into huge amounts of grassy textures and rocks, and that was about it. Skyward Sword compacted those ideas down and ensured that any area the player entered would be dynamic and lively. The 3 surface areas accomplished this. They're fairly large in scope, but instead of running aimlessly across flat lands to get through them, Link actually has to traverse the landscape, defeating enemies, solving puzzles, and making shortcuts along the way. All the while, the story of the area is progressing along and Link is learning more about the creatures that live there and their connection to the rest of the world. While this is a far cry from Breath of the Wild, it was a change and focused the gameplay on traversal, making sure little to no time is wasted getting from A to B. The player was always going to be actively engaged with the world around them and therefore actively progressing the narrative forward at the game's desired pace. And while that might lead you to believe that the dungeons of the game would just blend in with the rest of the surface areas then, that doesn't really feel true either. Dungeons do feel shorter and more streamlined, but that just means they don't wear out their welcome. And not only are the dungeons in this game memorable, they too tend to have narratives of their own. Bosses are now given context, sometimes prefaced by an encounter with Girahim, and some are even giving exciting pre-boss build-up. Each encounter is dynamic and has more attention to detail and atmosphere than ever before in the series, putting an epic cap on the experience in each area. Of course, if you want an area to freely explore, there was always the sky, and even the sky is pretty cleverly designed. The sky is inherently easier to navigate than your average field because it's built in such a way that you can see a huge chunk of it as you travel through it. It kind of follows that Xenoblade philosophy of giving you plenty of landmarks to work off of so that you never got lost or overwhelmed by the scale of it, but it does feel quite vast. While most of the sky is optional and flying is a bit tedious, it does offer up a plethora of nice side quests and things to do, and the way the game is paced will encourage you to leave few stones unturned if you're just going along doing everything. As the hub of the game, it does a decent job both feeling large and easy to navigate. It feels like one big area that's cohesive with Skyloft, as denizens of the town actually do come and go from the different islands in the sky for different events and side quests. It's important to note too that Skyward Sword's world feels dynamic. Events and side quests will build off of one another as the game progresses, and the cast of Skyloft is just small enough that pretty much every citizen of the town gets their moment to shine. No one is really just a generic NPC. I don't think it's a bold statement to say that Majora's Mask is the only game that can compete with Skyward Sword in how alive this world actually feels, and contributing to that is the very tight focus the game has on making this world accessible. Which means now we talk about the gameplay itself. I think this is the hardest part of the game to talk about because your mileage can and will vary. I myself am not very good at the controls, and years later I still find myself struggling with some of the things the game wants me to do. But having watched other people play it shows me that some people basically have no problems with the game and it can run like a dream for them. Throwing out whether or not the controls actually work, I think one thing can be said about the way this game was made. Nintendo really committed and explored the idea of motion controls. Skyward Sword really was the epitome of Nintendo's vision for the Wii. Many other developers saw the Wii and its success and just thought, okay, let's make a game where you wave the stick, but Nintendo knew better. They understood that while yes, the Wiimote inherently engages a player, crafting a truly immersive experience, actually making a game out of this thing, takes a lot of care and planning. This game is designed around the fact that motion controls are a thing. The way enemies move, the way they're defeated, the way the world is laid out, what sort of obstacles you face, everything has been made with those controls in mind. You will constantly be thinking about the way you hold your controller and the way you move it as you play. My point is, if the game's controls worked 100% of the time for every person who played, it would be an excellent experience. This control scheme where pretty much every item requires active input from the player via motion is very engaging. Every item ensures that you're aiming or flicking the Wiimote or swinging it or twisting it to navigate. The game makes you do that much more than previously. And nowhere is this more apparent than the sword itself. The sword in Zelda has always been a bit of a crutch. It kinda had mundane utility. It was always just there for you to use. It was your bread and butter. It had a whole button dedicated to it. And while both iterations of Zelda worked to make combat more diverse, at the end of the day, you still just pressed a button and Link swung. Tap, swing, tap, swing. Oh hey, if you L-target, Link will do a vertical slash, which does basically nothing different than the horizontal one and is never actually required. In Skyward Sword, that all changed. Now the sword is this element of the game you will constantly have to think about and carefully consider. You don't just attack with it, you have to think about how you're going to attack with it. What's the right cut for this job? Where does my sword have to be to make this work? Swordplay is made more interesting and involved, and defeating enemies isn't just mindless swinging at the right time. I can think of many other games where the combat isn't just mostly based on timing. And yet, many of Skyward Sword's enemies really required you to think about what you could do with the sword. And the game challenged you to never stop thinking, and never stop improving. Every time you got complacent, they'd up the ante with a Stalfos, or throw an upgraded Girahim at you to keep you on your toes. A lot of the enemies were simple enough that they only required a little more thought to take out, but it was never mindless. When the game came out, it felt like that was the future of Zelda. It felt like this is what swordplay was always going to be from now on. It was really immersive, it was really involved, and when it worked, goddamn, it worked. It felt great to finally win a duel with Girahim, or finally manage a great run of the bamboo minigame. You felt like a sword master. This was a bit of motion control that felt kind of nuanced. It felt complex and planned, and it was satisfying to have to put in that little bit of extra effort. It must have become apparent at some point during development that focusing on the motion control gameplay was going to change everything about the way the game played. From there, it only made sense to redesign the way we see Zelda. Skyward Sword changed what Zelda could be. Now, it could be a series with advanced swordplay that was entirely player-driven. It could be a streamlined experience that was constantly engaging the player, and it could be a tight, story-driven game that brings players closer to these characters than ever. This game did shake up the Zelda formula. It diverted the series away from the path of ever-increasing scale, purposefully loose narratives, and gameplay that every other adventure series was using and in some cases did better. Skyward Sword was really revolutionary. So why then is it not revered as such today? I think there are a few answers to this question, the most universal being that when the game came out, people were excited to finally play the game. Everyone's first time is different, but Skyward Sword had design choices that made it difficult to go back to. The infamous Fee hand-holding and constant disruptive info pop-ups make repetition in this game an utter chore. The commitment to motion controls also hurts the game's replayability because it is such a weird thing to go back to now that the days of motion control are over. Plus, as I said, this is a game that demands your attention and your focus. It's not something you just want to pick up and casually run through when you have to carefully tighten up your swordplay at every obstacle. While everything that comprises the game is good, it's just not as fun to experience a second time when all the secrets are revealed and the mysteries are uncovered. This is just inherently part of a game that is driven by story. It's never going to be as fun the second time. I also think that with Breath of the Wild's release, the idea of what a Zelda game should be has changed considerably, and Breath of the Wild's minimalist style with regards to story gets a lot of attention as games become more linear and controlled. When Skyward Sword came out, I think people were wishing for a more narratively driven experience with Zelda. This was a time when Fire Emblem didn't have the massive popularity it has today, and Xenoblade was just a tiny niche title that wasn't coming to America. That left Zelda as the most story-driven Nintendo franchise at that point, and Skyward Sword was a move closer to what fans wanted. Now Nintendo does have some more story-driven options, so rather than continuing down that path with Zelda, they've just taken it back to its roots. And drawing off of that, I do feel like public opinion started to really turn on Skyward Sword when a particularly influential YouTuber decided to go on a rant about how bad the game is in a discussion of a franchise since. Consequently, this is about the time it became popular opinion to want a Zelda game that was more open world and open-ended. And I want to address this. This is kind of personal to me specifically, and you can feel free to tune me out if you want, but I think about this particular segment in that particular video every time someone decries Skyward Sword because the criticism of the game was never this bad before the video came out. I have to talk briefly about the Zelda sequelitis video. This is a video with 12 million views, and yeah, I know, I overestimate the degree to which YouTube videos have influences on public opinion, but to put that number in perspective, Skyward Sword itself only sold about 3.5 million units, so yeah, a lot of people have seen this video. In it, Egoraptor places Skyward Sword as the epitome of everything that is wrong with the Zelda franchise. It's linear, it's handholdy, it doesn't work, it focuses far too much on odd jobs. These are all criticisms echoed by many of Skyward Sword's detractors, and I can agree with a lot of them on their own, but I can't stand that they're not put into some kind of context. It was ever since watching that video in particular that I've wanted to re-examine Skyward Sword and take a deep dive into why people liked this game when it came out. You might notice too that the crux of my argument is the complete opposite of his. He talks about how Skyward Sword perverts the idea of a Zelda game, how it's just a bad game and wrapped in a Zelda package that makes everyone love it. He uses this overly long, soppy metaphor to make his point, and that's just an opinion. Skyward Sword changed everything about Zelda at the time based on the direction Nintendo was headed with this series at the time. You don't design an entire console around a remote that you move around and make things happen with, and then just don't design a Zelda that takes the idea to its full potential. And when you then design a Zelda game around using a sword, you don't just drop Link into a giant open world. No, you have to be more calculated than that. You have to base your game around the combat. You have to integrate the sword and all the ways you can use this now essential piece of Zelda lore into the puzzles. And when you're streamlining the world and having the players do specific things, you can't motivate them with the exploration anymore, so you beef up the story to keep your player invested and moving forward. This is how all of this ties together. The changes made to the franchise in Skyward Sword were deliberate. You can see how its strength all stems from the decisions to make this game that uses the technology of the day to its fullest potential. This game broke just as many of series conventions that Breath of the Wild did at the time. And personally, I think Breath of the Wild suffers from some of the same issues that Skyward Sword does, despite being the overall better product. Breath of the Wild is hard to go back to and replay. I haven't wanted to touch the game since I beat it the first time, because although it would surely be a unique experience from the first time I played it, there's a hell of a lot of empty space in the game. There's a lot of time trying to find ways to force yourself up walls. There's just a lot of running in one direction until you happen to find the next thing. There's a lot of completing similar but different tasks for the same reward in shrines and stuff. Breath of the Wild's issues are rooted in its design and its very nature, while a reluctance to replay Skyward Sword, I feel, mostly comes from the poor choices that could be easily rectified. Which is why Skyward Sword HD is a huge deal. Skyward Sword is a game that could really benefit from some reworking and repolishing. There is so much here that could improve the overall quality of the game. Take away the annoying tedious pop-ups when you collect an item or rupee. Take away Fi's comments on literally everything. Speed up flying a bit. Fine-tune those controls. This is a remaster of a game that could actually benefit from one. Just fixing the tedium in the game would be enough, but they are actually working on to improve the controls too. In just a few easy steps, this could truly be a definitive version of this game, and without the little things dragging it down, the story, the characters, the world, the level design, and the gameplay will all shine brighter. I hope, beyond hope, that this remaster fixes everything and more. I don't have a lot of faith, but I have hope. The idea of a fully immersive Zelda game that really puts you into the role of Link as he learns the way of the sword remains tantalizing, and if this version finally turns Skyward Sword into the game it was meant to be, it just might remind fans that this is a viable series for the path to follow in the future as well, and was once viewed as an essential step towards the series' evolution.